Welcome to Module 3, which is devoted to the so-called Gnostic Gospels and why these are not in your New Testament. Before I get to the Gnostic Gospels, just to recap a little, we've seen in the previous modules how the authentic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John circulated throughout the ancient Roman Empire. We learned that they circulated in the form of a codex, not written on scrolls, but in the form of a codex. And we also saw how easy, really, communication and travel was back in ancient Rome when we looked at that road map that showed all of those Roman roads and how each road was broken up into just one day's journey on foot. So we've seen how the Gospels circulated throughout the Roman Empire and how easy it was for them to circulate. Well, besides the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, other things were circulating throughout the Roman Empire as well. The so-called Gnostic Gospels were circulating probably 100 to 200 years after the time of the New Testament. Now, scholars will debate those dates, but those are the dates that I have settled on. 100 to 200 years, even a little bit later, for some of the so-called Gnostic texts. What do I mean by these? Well, there were several other Gospels besides the ones that you've read. There were probably ultimately around 50 other Gospels that were written and that circulated widely throughout the Roman Empire. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Thomas, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas that made such a stir back in 2006. The church has always known, either by title or by actually having the documents or by references to these other documents in the writings of the church fathers, the church has always known about these other gospels, these so-called Gnostic gospels. The church has known about them, the church read most of them and has rejected them, and we're going to see why in this module. Now, I keep referring to them as the Gnostic Gospels, for such is their title. Time for me to define this term. What do I mean by Gnosticism? Gnosticism, well, perhaps the easiest way to think of it is as the original New Age spirituality. So all of the so-called New Age spiritualities that we see around us today, that Scientology building over on East Douglas, Madonna and all the stars in Hollywood that used to wrap red strings around their wrists. They were reading the Jewish Gnostic text, the Kabbalah. A lot of New Age spirituality is really nothing new. A lot of New Age spirituality is based on Gnosticism that was very much in vogue at the time of the New Testament and even later. What do I mean by Gnosticism? Gnosticism comes from the Greek word gnosis, which simply means saving knowledge. So this is how Gnosticism works. It purports to give you some kind of secret saving knowledge that very few else have, or only the inside group has. So you see how elitist it is from the core. Gnostics believe that they have some kind of secret saving knowledge that nobody else who's out there just living their faith, going to church, trying to keep the 10 Commandments, that's way too slow for the Gnostics. They don't rely on the scriptures or the sacraments or the liturgy. Instead, they relied on this secret saving knowledge that they thought they had and really nobody else did who wasn't part of the in group. Gnosticism speaks a lot about truth with a capital T, and this saving truth, this secret truth, is what is meant to set one free. It is what is meant to save a person. Gnosticism was highly syncretistic. It borrowed from Judaism, it borrowed from Christianity, it borrowed from Eastern Oriental cults. I'll explain a little bit more about it, but something that I want to emphasize here at the start is that Gnosticism is not something that's over and done with. It is not just ancient history. Gnosticism is all around us. Again, I mentioned those New Age spiritualities. That's easy to see the workings of Gnosticism there. But really, it's all around us. It's even at the movies. Let's just look at this film clip from The Matrix. I want to show you this clip, and then after you watch this clip, I'm going to unpack the Gnostic elements that we see buried in this admittedly interesting movie from Hollywood, at least interesting in terms of special effects. And let's watch the clip, and then I'll pull out some of the Gnostic elements in the clip.
Had a dream, Neo, that you were so sure was real? What if you were unable to wake from that dream? How would you know the difference between the dream world and the real world?
What is happening to me?
The answer is out there, Neo. It's the question that drives us.
What is the Matrix?
The Matrix is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth.
What truth?
They're watching you, Neo.
Human beings are a disease. You are a cancer of this planet. And we are the cure. Get me the hell out of here!
Welcome to the real world.
So you're here to save the world.
So what do you need? Guns. Lots of guns.
No one has ever done anything like this.
That's why it's going to work.
Buckle your seatbelt, Dorothy. Because Kansas is going bye-bye.
Unfortunately, no one can be told what the Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself.
The Matrix is a very popular and very Gnostic movie coming out of Hollywood. Did you catch, so many of the Gnostic elements just in that little trailer. No one can be told about the Matrix. You have to see it for yourself. Again, the secret, saving knowledge that's behind that kind of statement. Ever had a dream that you cannot wake up from, and then how can you tell the dream world from the real world? Well, the way you make that transition is to stumble across the truth, the secret saving truth reserved just for a small band of intimates. That's Gnosticism. That this secret saving truth is what sets you free from the dream world that you're walking around, that everybody else that's just sort of schlepping through life, going to church, trying to do God's will, trying to follow the commandments. They don't see the real world that you see once you have the secret saving knowledge that comes via Gnosticism. When Agent Smith makes that sneering comment, human beings are a disease. They're like a cancer, and we're the cure. Gnosticism denigrated the physical. It denigrated anything material, anything created. And so this is a key idea in Gnosticism. The physical created world is the dream world. It's the weak, corrupt, fragile world. And the real world, the spiritual world, is the world that is constituted by the saving truth, the secret saving truth of Gnosticism. So salvation for a Gnostic comes by receiving this exotic, secret, saving truth. It's not anything that anybody else could read in the scriptures. It's not anything else anybody could learn by going to church. Instead, it's this secret, saving knowledge reserved just for them. Another few minutes, if you will, just on this comparison between Gnosticism and Orthodox Christianity. Obviously, liturgical worship, public worship, going to Mass, that's way too slow for a Gnostic. The Gnostic isn't interested in what the great unwashed are interested in. The Gnostic is interested in the secret saving truth that's reserved just for him or her. So public worship, liturgical worship, that's not what Gnostics are interested in. Neither are they interested at all in the sacraments. Again, we know why now. The sacraments use created physical material, things like bread and wine and oil, and the Gnostic just looks down on anything physical, anything material, as something weak and corrupt and fragile. What is strong and eternal and spiritual is this secret saving truth. So Gnostics do not believe that God works through sacraments. They don't believe God works through the created world. The created world is something bad, something to be released from, not something that can communicate God's grace, as Orthodox Christianity believes happens in the sacraments. Obviously, the Gnostics deny the incarnation. God taking flesh, God becoming one of us, God taking this physical, fleshly body. They deny the incarnation, and they hold to an idea called Docetism. You'll see this more in your controversies in church history class, but Docetism is the belief that God didn't really become man, he didn't really become one of us, he just appeared to. God wouldn't go to such lengths as to take up a human body that was weak and fallible and fleshly. So Docetists don't believe that God really became man in Jesus. In fact, Jesus was just walking around as God, looking, appearing like man. Anytime anybody says, oh, well, that was easy for Jesus, let's say the temptations in the wilderness, that wasn't really a challenge for him because he was God, or the crucifixion didn't really hurt him that much because he was God, that's Docetism, basically. It's denying the real humanity of Christ. So anytime we, even Orthodox Catholics, fall into this idea that, oh, well, that wouldn't have really been such a challenge for Jesus because he was God, careful, that's starting to shift into Docetism. Anything that denies the real humanity of Christ is problematic for Orthodox Christianity. So, of course, salvation for a Gnostic doesn't happen by Christ's death on a cross. That's bloody, that's physical, that's fleshly. No, salvation doesn't come by Christ's death on a cross. For them, it comes by, now we know, receiving this secret saving knowledge. Okay, so that's just really a too brief summary of Gnosticism, but I'm not all that interested in you learning all of the tenets of Gnosticism, and you'll catch a little bit more of its flavor once we start to read some of the Gnostic Gospels. But we can see just how different Christianity would be if Christianity ever would fall under any of these Gnostic ideas, let alone let any of these Gnostic Gospels into the canon of the New Testament. Christianity would be very different. We would not have sacraments. We would not believe in the incarnation. We would not believe in the resurrection of the body at the end time. Again, Gnostics reject that idea that we are going to receive our bodies back after Judgment Day. They reject that idea because, again, they see the body, the physical, as something weak and fragile and corrupt and something to be freed from. Okay, I think that's enough for right now in terms of an overview for Gnosticism. That's, again, a very brief outline of some of the principal Gnostic ideas that were operating after the time of the New Testament, during the time when these Gnostic Gospels were written. Let's fast forward now to 1945. This is when these Gnostic Gospels are rediscovered. Now let me emphasize that they are being rediscovered in 1945. It is not as if they were discovered for the first time then. The church has always known about these. The church fathers, especially Origen, Irenaeus, they refuted Gnosticism. They quoted Gnosticism extensively in their refutations of these ideas. The church has always known about these Gnostic Gospels, and the church fathers went to great lengths to refute their ideas. But in 1945, a huge trove of them, of these Gnostic texts, a huge trove was rediscovered. It was rediscovered in a place called Nag Hammadi, which is in Upper Egypt. Nag Hammadi is a town of about 30,000 people to this day, and it sits along the banks of the Nile River. But the important thing to remember about Nag Hammadi is not its location by the river. Instead, it's the location of these caves that were sitting up close to the Nile. It's up in these caves that a huge trove of Gnostic Gospels was rediscovered in 1945. They were hidden inside these caves. I want to give you the who, what, where, and why of how these Gnostic Gospels were rediscovered in 1945 at Nag Hammadi, actually up in these caves overlooking Nag Hammadi. The man who made the discovery was Muhammad Ali Salman, and he was a Bedouin, a tender of flocks. He is out tending his sheep or goats or whatever he was in charge of around these caves up by Nag Hammadi, and he goes into these caves on a mission. He's looking basically for bat dung. Bat dung was used as fuel by the Bedouins around Nag Hammadi, and so Muhammad Ali Salman goes into these caves searching for bat dung to use to start a fire, when he stumbles into these caves and he discovers several huge ceramic jars stuffed full of codexes, let me use the correct plural, codices of many documents. What he finds, it's unbeknownst to him at this time, but inside these ceramic jars were copies, codices of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of the Infancy, according to St. Thomas. Many documents, many Gnostic texts are found stuffed inside these ceramic jars. Now, Muhammad Ali Salman can't read or write. He is illiterate, so he doesn't really know what he has on his hands at this time. In fact, he says later that he took several of those documents and he burned them along with the bat dung that he found as fuel for his camp out there. But at this point, he has found several ceramic jars filled with Gnostic texts. Now the story gets rather dark here, and it turns into a series of blood feuds and vendettas and even murder. Muhammad Ali Salman is going to commit murder along the way in his attempt to hang on to these ceramic jars and the texts that are contained within them. But ultimately, he's going to take them to a museum in Cairo. So something right out of Indiana Jones. He takes these ceramic jars to Cairo where somebody can read them, and the find of the century, at least in terms of the New Testament, is underway. 1945, these things are found, and it takes a while before they make it to the museum in Cairo where someone can actually read and decipher these Gnostic texts. Now, if you notice on this image here, these texts were not in good shape. Again, they're 2,000 years old, almost. They're in bad shape, they're weathered, they're torn. Someone had to painstakingly reconstruct all of the little fragments found inside those jars. They had to not only reconstruct them, but then they had to translate them, obviously. And so it took years, and there were really only a handful of scholars who could do this kind of work. So because it took so long to reconstruct these documents and then to start translating them, and just a handful of people could do it, a conspiracy theory starts to take root. They're discovered in 1945, takes several decades, and still people haven't seen what was discovered. So of course the conspiracy theory shifts into high gear. And what does the Vatican have that it won't let us see? Now, the Vatican had nothing to do with this. There was a Catholic scholar at Notre Dame involved in the project, but there were several scholars at several universities around the world. It took a long time to translate these things, and in the meantime, a conspiracy theory was set up, and that still drives some of the publicity around the Gnostic Gospels. Now, since they've all been published, what was found at Nag Hammadi. Since these things have all been published, the conspiracy theory has lessened, but it doesn't ever really go away because it makes for such good theater, and so you see it in the advertising whenever somebody wants to talk about the Gnostic Gospels. Okay, so much for an overview of Gnosticism and a very brief introduction to where these Gnostic Gospels came from. Let's actually turn now to look at one. Let's look at the Gospel of Thomas. It is, of course, not authentic. This is a Gnostic Gospel. And you can read the whole thing if you just Google Gospel of Thomas. I'm just going to look at the beginning and at the end of this Gospel. I think it will be enough to prove my point, and you'll get a taste of what's going on in these Gnostic documents. Here's how the Gospel of Thomas begins. These are the secret sayings that the living Jesus spoke and Didymus Judas Thomas recorded. So notice right away we're in the realm of Gnosticism with this mention up front of these secret sayings that are meant only for you, the reader, not for anybody else. These are secret sayings that Jesus supposedly gave to Thomas, who's passing them on to you. And here's the first saying. And he said, whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death. Notice the interpretation of these sayings, the gnosis, this supposedly saving Gnostic truth, that is what keeps a person from death. The authentic gospel will say things like, whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood will have eternal life. But in the Gospel of Thomas, there's none of that, of course. Remember how the Gnostics just denigrated the physical. They were anti-matter, anti-creation, anti-body, anti-sex, anti-marriage, anti-sacraments, all of that. And so, of course, it's not the sacraments that bring eternal life. Instead, it's this discovery of this secret saving knowledge, the interpretation of these secret sayings that supposedly brings eternal life. When you know yourselves, then you will be known and you will understand that you are children of the living Father. Not too bad there. But if you do not know yourselves, then you live in poverty and you are the poverty. Again, there is nothing like that in the authentic Gospels. Here with this statement that you are the poverty, there again, once again, is this Gnostic denigration of the bodily, and it's going to continue, believe me. Jesus said, for many of the first will be last and will become a single one. Let me tell you, this reference to becoming a single one, there's a bizarre Gnostic myth behind this, and it's really not worth learning. You could see, again, passing references to this kind of thing in the Matrix if you're really into it. Saying 13, Jesus said to his disciples, compare me to something and tell me what I am like. Simon Peter said to him, you are like a just messenger. Notice in the authentic gospel, Simon Peter confesses that Jesus is the Messiah. Not here. Simon supposedly says, you are like a just messenger. Matthew said to him, you are like a wise philosopher. Thomas said to him, teacher, my mouth is utterly unable to say what you are like. Jesus said, I am not your teacher. Because you have drunk, you have become intoxicated from the bubbling spring that I have tended. Again, that bubbling spring is a reference to the saving truth that comes from discovering gnosis, or this secret saving knowledge. Later on, Salome said, who are you, mister? You have climbed onto my couch and eaten from my table as if you are from someone. Jesus said to her, I am the one who comes from what is whole. Again, more Gnostic mythology. I was granted things of my Father. I am your disciple, she said. Notice it's Gnostic mythology, this I am the one who comes from what is whole. That's not one of the authentic teachings of Jesus. Okay, so that's how the thing gets started. Let's look now at how this thing ends. And again, you can read the whole thing if you like, if you just go to Google and enter Gospel of Thomas. Saying 62. I want to just pick a couple here from the end. Saying 62. I disclose my mysteries to those who are worthy of my mysteries. Well, how very elitist there. I mean, the New Testament, the authentic New Testament, says how blessed are the poor in spirit, not the Gospel of Thomas. This Gnostic Gospel says how blessed are those elites who learn my saving secrets. Those are the ones who are worthy of my mysteries. Saying 87, again, another reference to Gnostic anti-body attitudes. Jesus said, how miserable is the body that depends on a body, and how miserable is the soul that depends on these two. Again, you see how Gnostics they really lived in this spiritual ivory tower. It's very new agey here. It's very elitist. It's very idealistic. They want nothing to do with mundane things like body and sex and marriage and created life, and the physical world was corrupt and passing away, and so it was unworthy of their Gnostic speculations. You can see how just this anti-physicality runs throughout Gnostic documents, and it bleeds over into an opposition to sacraments and an opposition to many things that Orthodox Christianity holds up as good. Saying 105, Jesus said, whoever knows the father and the mother will be called the child of a whore. Now, that's not very nice. I'm not really sure what's behind that. I guess, again, maybe this anti-physical bias that the Gnostics have. That would be my best guess there. Saying 108, Jesus said, whoever drinks from my mouth will become like me. I myself shall become that person, and the hidden things will be revealed to him. Again, this Gnostic elitist desire for revealed secrets that nobody else is privy to. Saying 112, Jesus said, damn the flesh that depends on the soul, damn the soul that depends on the flesh. Okay, I think you get that point from Gnostic thought there. 113, his disciples said to him, when will the kingdom come? It will not come by watching for it. It will not be said, look here or look there. Rather, the Father's kingdom is spread out upon the earth, and the people don't see it. You see some awareness of Orthodox New Testament sayings, and you see that what Gnosticism does is it listens partly to what makes it into the Orthodox canon of the New Testament. It uses some of that language, but then it just spins out of control into these weird Gnostic speculations. Here we'll see how it starts, it sounds rather biblical, it sounds rather authentic right there, but look how it ends in 114. Simon Peter said to them, make Mary, as in Mary Magdalene, leave us, for females don't deserve life. Jesus said, look, I will guide her to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every female who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven. Here we can see this Gnostic nonsense just really spin out of control. Of course, Gnosticism denigrated anything physical. The body was bad. Male bodies were bad, but they were better than female bodies according to Gnosticism. So female bodies are at the bottom of the totem pole, and in order to be saved, a female has to make herself male. Is utter nonsense, and that's quite offensive, really, to women. Now, it always amazes me that so many of these secular, liberal academics just love the Gospel of Thomas, and they say things like, oh, this authentic voice in early Christianity was just stamped out by the authoritarian church. They say things like that, but then when you actually read this stuff, and look how this thing ends, about females having to become male to be saved, they skip over that. All of these liberal secular academics who are, lifting up the Gospel of Thomas, they totally ignore the way this thing ends, and they never mention this part of it in their, exaltation of this as this lost voice that unfortunately was stamped out by, again, this authoritarian Orthodox Church. When you read this, and again, feel free to read the whole thing, who would want this in the New Testament? Again, it's pretty much a no-brainer, it seems to me. This is not Orthodox teaching. It was with good reason that the church easily turned away from these texts and did not accept Gnostic ideas into the canon of inspired scripture. Perhaps the most acclaimed American scholar, someone who made her academic career on the Gnostic Gospels, is a woman named Elaine Pagels, who came out with her text in 1979, simply titled The Gnostic Gospels. And so you see how long it took for the Gnostic Gospels to actually reach publication. Discovered in 1945, it's not until 1979 that they are published by Elaine Pagels in this country. This starts the cottage industry that's still going strong in this country around the Gnostic Gospels. If you go into Barnes & Noble, you can see just entire shelves filled with books on the Gnostic Gospels, books claiming to reinvent Christianity based on the Gnostic Gospels. It's, again, a cottage industry that is still doing well for its authors in this country. Bart Ehrman is probably the most recent notable author to publish on the Gnostic Gospels. His book is simply called Lost Scriptures, Books That Did Not Make It Into the New Testament. I think the title's a little off. I wouldn't call them lost scriptures. I would call them rejected scriptures or rejected texts. It's not as if the church didn't know about these things or they were lost and now they've been restored to us. The church has always known and rejected these texts, and you'll see why for yourself shortly. I honestly don't know exactly why these scholars are so enamored of the Gnostic Gospels. I find them rather tedious to read personally. Certainly nothing in them is inspiring to a person's faith. They do shed a lot of light on first and second and third century culture around the Mediterranean. Perhaps people are enamored of these because they have an agenda of their own and they want to change Christianity. There's something they don't like about the current day church, and so they think that Gnostic Gospels will be their ammunition to somehow change the church or to change her teachings. Again, I don't want to be unfair to the scholars because a lot of them are very bright, very careful people, but still, I frankly don't understand the appeal of the Gnostic Gospels. Once you get past the publicity and all of the scary stories about conspiracy theories or what does the Vatican have that they don't want you to read, once you get past that and actually read these things, I think their appeal just evaporates. Here's one more video clip, I think, as we approach reading the Gnostic Gospels. Let's look at this now.
Willing collaborator with Jesus. Our Mary Snow explains her report that first aired on the Situation Room. It questions the way Jesus died and what's been considered gospel for nearly 2,000 years. Was Judas Iscariot, one of the 12 disciples with Jesus in his final days, really a traitor, or was he the favorite disciple given a secret as part of a divine plan?
The Gospel of Judas is a real surprise. It pictures Judas not as the worst villain in the history of the world, as he's always been thought of in Christian tradition, but as the one disciple whom Jesus entrusts with secret understanding.
That secret understanding, say scholars, is contained in these writings from 300 A.D. and referred to by researchers as the Gospel of Judas. The writings reveal Judas handed Jesus over to the authorities because Jesus instructed him to do so as part of a plan for salvation and not for money or because of Satan, as written in the Bible. Why is it only coming to light now? Scholars say the early church considered these secret teachings blasphemy.
Many of these were buried, attacked, challenged, denounced, and this text has just barely survived.
The National Geographic Society partnered with scholars to restore and translate the battered documents that were found in a desert in Egypt in the 1970s, traded on the antiquities market, and then stashed inside a safe deposit box for 16 years in New York before an arts dealer returned them to Europe. There is skepticism about their content. A Vatican historian calls the Judas Gospel, quote, a product of religious fantasy. Other scholars say it changes nothing.
It's artificial, mythological invention of the 2nd century.
The scholars who studied these texts say whether they're true or not, they add to the understanding of the complexity of Christianity. Mary Snow, CNN, New York.
They've been looking at this issue on the Situation Room, and you can see more stories like this, 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific, with our friend Wolf Blitzer.
Okay, the Gospel of Judas probably made the biggest stir most recently. Back in 2006, National Geographic devoted an entire issue to the Gospel of Judas. And the Gospel of Judas wasn't found at Nag Hammadi. It was something that surfaced through the black market, actually. And so it was not part of the treasure trove that Muhammad Ali Salman found at Nag Hammadi, but it surfaced from different channels, and it finally made it to public awareness in 2006. I'll play just another little clip on the Gospel of Judas in just a moment, but the point I want to make here is we might find other Gnostic texts, or other Gnostic texts, other Gnostic Gospels may surface. There were dozens, at least 50, that the church knows of, and so it's possible that there could be other Gnostic texts out there that will be discovered one day, and if it is discovered, it will be again another big media sensation. The Gnostic Gospels, including the Gospel of Judas, they pretty much say the same thing. The details differ a little bit, but it's pretty much the same old thing rehashed in different forms. And so even if another Gnostic gospel is discovered, as long as it's rooted in Gnostic ideas, it's not going to be a challenge to the church. It's not going to be this aha moment where all of a sudden we've got this text that should have been included in the New Testament and was rejected for political reasons, and if only we had listened to this ancient voice, things would be very different. That's what you hear often in the publicity for these Gnostic documents, but again, once you actually read them for yourself, you're going to see it was a no-brainer, really, for the church in rejecting these Gnostic texts. Okay, let me just play the short video clip on the Gospel of Judas, and then I'm going to wrap things up after this. Okay, here's this clip. Okay, so much for the Gospel of Judas. We're going to read this as part of the reading assignment for this module. Let me just say, as we leave the Gospel of Judas here, that even if another Gnostic document surfaces and comes to light, there were reasons why the church rejected these things. It wasn't for political reasons. It wasn't, the Orthodox were the winners and the poor Gnostics were the losers, and that's how it's often characterized today, that it was just merely a political feat of the Orthodox being the winners and the Gnostics having the short end of the stick. That's not it at all. there were 4 classical criteria for what made it into the New Testament. Again, lots of documents are circulating in the early centuries of the church. There were 4 classical criteria for determining what was to be included in the canon of the New Testament. So let's look at these now. The 4 classical criteria for inclusion include, number 1, apostolic origin. Apostolic origin, back to the time of the apostles. Now notice, a document doesn't actually have to have been written by one of the apostles to be considered apostolic in origin. We know that Mark was not one of the 12 apostles, and yet here we have the Gospel of Mark. But Mark was a disciple of Peter, who obviously was an apostle. So by apostolic origin, the document either had to be written by an apostle, by one of those close associates and disciples of Jesus, or by someone who was a member of the apostolic circle, someone who was one of their disciples, or somebody who was living and working and ministering at the time of the apostles. All of the Gnostic texts are way too late to be apostolic in origin. They're at least 1 to 2, sometimes even 400 years too late to have any connection to the 12 apostles or to any of the members of the apostolic circle. So the Gnostic documents were rejected because they were not apostolic in origin. Now they claim the names of apostles, like the Gospel of Thomas, or somebody who was a member of the apostolic circle, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, but these Gnostic documents were written centuries after the time of Thomas or Mary Magdalene, and so they cannot claim to have been anywhere near the circle of the apostles. Number 2, universal acceptance. The letters of Paul were written and read for the liturgical assembly. The letters of Paul were circulating and were read during Mass, during the liturgy. Same with the Gospels. They were read out loud, they were proclaimed in the liturgical assembly where everyone could hear, where everyone could listen to the words. These circulated widely whenever a congregation would receive a letter of Paul or perhaps one of the Gospels. It would be read and proclaimed at Mass, at the liturgical assembly. No one ever had an authentic gospel and kept it in their back pocket and then just said, hey, look what I've got. This is just for you. That's what the Gnostics did. When the Gnostics had something, it was a lot of, hey, psst, I've got something just for you, this secret thing that's just between you and I. See how the authentic scriptures were universally accepted, they circulated widely, they were for any and all Christians to receive and to read and to pray. There was nothing secret or elitist or separate about the Christian scriptures, whereas the Gnostic Gospels were all that. They were all about the secret, esoteric, saving knowledge. So universal acceptance and distribution was another classical criterion for acceptance into the New Testament. Number 3, and this is extremely important, orthodox teaching. When you read the Gnostic Gospels, you will see so many weird, off-the-wall, unorthodox ideas there. Again, this is what makes it was such an easy decision for the church. These Gnostic documents do not have orthodox teaching in them. And when you read them, you will see this for yourself. The church had to recognize her own faith in a document in order for it to be included in the New Testament. And so the church was easily able to recognize her faith contained in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The church didn't recognize anything pertaining to her faith in the Gnostic documents. So orthodox teaching is the hallmark of the authentic Gospels, whereas the Gnostic Gospels contain nothing but weird Gnostic speculations that have nothing to do with orthodox teaching. 4 is, again, liturgical usage. So I've already mentioned the universal acceptance. This is a related point. The scriptures were worthy to be read at a liturgical assembly. When you look at the Gnostic Gospels, they were not worthy to be read aloud in a liturgical assembly. they were not suitable for a liturgical assembly. When you read them, you'll just see that they were just inappropriate for use at the Sunday liturgy. So liturgical usage is another one of the classical criteria. Now I have another one that I want to add, and I'll call it Giles' criterion. This is not one of the four classical ones. This is very much my own opinion. This is not something that the church ever used, but I think it holds water, and let me give it to you. We saw in the first module that the Gospels had the genre of biography, that the authentic Gospels were intended to be read as biographies of Christ, that they were written as inspired biographies about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, that they were biographies about Jesus. When you read the Gnostic Gospels, they are not biographies. They're not written in that form. They tell us very little about the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. They're not written in a biographical form. Instead, they're written like sayings, like a collection of sayings. And so what the Gnostic Gospels are, they're not biographies about Jesus. Instead, they're a collection of Gnostic sayings attributed to Jesus or put on the lips of Jesus, but they're in the form of a bunch of sayings, a collection of sayings. And so the Gnostic Gospels are much like the hypothetical Q document. We saw that previously. Q, quella, source document, a sayings source. The Gnostic Gospels, when you read them, they're more a collection of Gnostic sayings and Gnostic teachings than they are biographies of Jesus Christ. And so my criterion is that the Gnostic Gospels do not have the right form. They are not written as biographies, inspired biographies of the life of Jesus. And so that's Giles' criterion. It's not one of the official four, but I also think it's a valid point. And so while I in no way want to equate my criterion with the classical four, still, if you ever want to mention it, you've got my permission to use that. The Gnostic Gospels just aren't Gospels at all, really. They are Gnostic sayings that were compiled and then were attributed to either one of the apostles or Jesus himself. But you'll see for yourself just how woefully short they fall in comparison to the inspired, authentic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay, thank you very much for your attention on this module. The reading assignment is on the syllabus. It will include reading the Gospel of Judas, and I will show you where you can find that document. The instructions for finding that are on your syllabus as well. And then, of course, a threaded discussion awaits in your study group. I look forward to continuing the conversation with you there. Thank you. Until next time, goodbye and God bless.